I'd unmute.
Hello?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Hi, everyone. Welcome, everybody. I'm just looking at the online numbers. We've got quite a few people joining us online. So thank you all for being here. It's a beautiful sunny afternoon here in Brighton. So thank you for making time to join us today for this seminar with Tom Wein on varieties of dignity. So Tom is director at IDinsight, where he leads the Dignity Initiative. And this is work that he's been doing over many years, 10 at least.
Almost 10, I think.
Almost 10 or so. Prior to being at IDinsight, he spent some time in Uganda and he spent many years in Nairobi, Kenya. He's also a co-author of the book Marketplace Dignity with Kate Lamberton and with Neela Saldana. And he's currently working on a new book, which is what we get to hear some reflections about today. So Tom and I met a few months ago because we're both involved in a collaboration on the Full Spectrum Coalition, which is an evidence and learning initiative with a group of partners working on community-led development. And one of the things that I've really appreciated in our interactions around that, but also hearing you talk with such passion about this work on dignity, is that you have over years been looking at mountains, I would say, of evaluation and research data from work that you've done in many different contexts. And so that brings to it, I think, a very real sense of what the evidence is saying. So, and from that, then actually building up your theorizing, which is what you'll be sharing some of today. I also really appreciate that in the Dignity Initiative, you're not just doing the thinking about dignity and how important it is or how we frame our work around that, but you're actually pushing people to think about their own practice. So maybe if there's time, you can also share a bit about some of that work. I also wanted to just mention that Tom's a very proud father of baby Ollie, who we hear a lot about. And yeah, it's wonderful to have you here. So thank you for joining us. For everybody online, please do use the chat as we go through. So quite a simple format. Tom's going to spend 30 or so minutes sharing some of his thoughts on the different ways in which we can understand dignity. And then there should be plenty of time for discussion, for questions. I'll be monitoring the chat so we can pick up some of those questions coming in and yeah, hopefully have time for a great dialogue and helping us think about what's the relevance of this work to what we're doing, what we do here at IDS. So yeah, I think I will hand over to Tom to get us moving.
That's good. Hello, folks. Thank you so much for having me, Marina. Thank you for the generous introduction. This idea of dignity is one of those ideas that development people like to talk about a lot. It's the first few words in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are about dignity. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, when he gave his inauguration speech, one of the sort of core lines of it was, "Human dignity is the core of my work." All these people who we look to as leaders on development keep coming back to this idea. It keeps showing up in report titles and so on. And yet, you don't see a lot of programming decisions made on the idea of dignity. It doesn't really, its importance in rhetoric doesn't really seem to be reflected in the practice of development. And that matters, I think, because when you go much wider than that and ask the people who are served by development, actually when you ask people all over the world, when you do these cross-cultural studies as we've been able to do in India and Nigeria and the United States and Another academic, formerly of Oxford, Mansour Lalji, did comparative work in India and Northern Ireland and Dubai. And across these places, people really care about dignity. It really matters to people, both when we ask them in qualitative research, why does this matter to you? People say, it matters to me enough that I'd be willing to pay costs to make sure that my dignity is respected. And so it seems to me, therefore, that there's this sort of broken promise when it comes to dignity. We're talking about this, and we're not really following through. When you look at the latest round of Afrobarometer data, they look at public service interactions all across Africa. They're looking specifically at health, security and public security and policing, and education, and obtaining documents, the fourth one. And across all of those, about a third of public service interactions, people report as being disrespectful. We can come on to more about why that might matter in terms of other metrics and outcomes and other things that we might care about in development later on. But for now, let's just take the values reason. People who lead development say they care about it, and the democratic reason. The people who development serve say they care about it. Scholars certainly seem to care about it. A lot gets written about dignity. This classification of different stages of evidence borrows from work by Evan Lieberman. He has this lovely paper about different stages of evidence and how to categorize them. It's just one of those incredibly useful things for all types of research. And we have loads of theoretical and normative studies, loads of philosophy, loads of legal studies, loads of people explaining, this is what I think about dignity, this is what this text thinks about dignity. We have a fair number of descriptive studies, some really interesting qualitative work about this is what these people living in this situation think about dignity. We've got slightly fewer, but a reasonable number of what Lieberman classifies as early stage experiments, experiments that might be taking place in laboratory conditions, experiments to study psychological questions, often in the United States. We have many fewer of what Lieberman calls late stage experiments, so studies of real world attempts to change whether people feel their dignity has been respected. And there's really very little associational quantitative survey work, really very, and I don't think anybody's tried natural experiments. I'm not surprised that that's true, but I think certainly these ones, it feels like there could be a bit more, and we're a little bit unbalanced. This book, the Cambridge Handbook of Human Dignity, is a fantastic book. It's an absolute treasury of all of this theoretical and normative work. So many different understandings, as like 60, 70 essays. It's huge, this thing, with this is what the Buddhist idea of dignity is, and this is what the classical Hindu idea of dignity is, and this is how dignity is viewed in early Christian thought and Middle Ages Christian thought, and so on, and different Enlightenment thinkers. It's a really wonderful book. It's such a treasury, but it is firmly in this tradition. That has been the main way that people have explained how dignity varies. They've done it by theoretical tradition, theological or philosophical tradition. They've said this tradition says this scholar says that. The other main way that we see through a lot of these descriptive studies is essentially variation by country. People say, this is the South African or Southern African tradition of dignity. There's a wonderful series of papers from the Overseas Development Institute, their humanitarian policy group a few years ago, led by Kerry Holloway, did this series of brilliant qualitative papers on the experience of refugees of dignity and how they understood it. And I'm compressing those papers. There's lots of nuance in there, but they tend to come down to this is how Colombian IDPs think about dignity. This is how, and then others have said, this is how Americans think about dignity. And this attempt to categorize it by country. So we've got categorization by philosophical tradition, categorization by country. And then there's a few other attempts to explain how dignity varies. One of them, or even just to categorize and describe how dignity varies. One of them is the sort of medical approach to this, which is essentially to give up and say, this is our definition of dignity, this is what dignity is, and just to keep importing it across countries with minor changes to how they ask the survey questions. One of them, there's an essay by a sociologist called Geza Lindemann, who says that it's all about individualism versus collectivism. And individualistic societies have this idea of dignity, and collectivist societies have this idea of dignity. Intriguing to explore. It's one essay, she doesn't take it much further than that. And then there's a line of work from cultural psychology, scholars like Dov Cohen and Angela Lung. Cohen and Lung have this lovely paper together where they look at this idea of cultural syndromes, is what they call it. And they say some societies are dignity societies, and some societies are honor societies, and others are face societies. And this is like trying to say this is the most important value in this society versus that society. I like that work. It's one of the really nice things they do is that they allow room for rebellion. So they say, this is the big idea that people in North America arrange their society around is dignity. Even if you're rebelling against that, you're still organizing yourself around that assumption. It's really interesting work. They've got some lovely empirical work to support it. But we've got all of these try to come up with try to assign these traditions of dignity or these ideas of dignity to a place. Now, that's not wrong, because place is really important in people's experience of dignity. When you run cross-sectional analyses, when you do regressions of surveys in the Afrobarometer data, in other surveys that we've conducted, the most significant predictor of people's experience of whether they were treated in a way that respected their dignity, the most significant predictor, therefore, of prevalence of respect or disrespect, is indeed place. More important than gender, more important than socioeconomic status, more important than urban-rural placement, is this thing about where do you live? That seems to really affect controlling for lots of other things, everything we could think of that seemed sensible to control for, that seemed to keep affecting people's experience of dignity. So place is important, but when you start doing qualitative work in some of these places, as we've been doing over recent years, you find that the idea is just much more ragged than that. And in fact, in scholarship on dignity, you get a lot of invective about the idea of dignity. Academics can be very rude in private, but when they're naming their papers, they tend to be quite cautious and conservative. But there are paper titles that are dignity is a useless concept, dignity is a vacuous concept. People really feel very strongly that just give up. It's so complicated trying to capture dignity. Because when you ask people about it, they don't neatly follow those country boxes that we were looking at before. They don't neatly follow the philosophical traditions that are supposed to be assigned to them. When you move from theoretical work to social science work, to qualitative work in particular, it all gets much messier. The one philosopher calls dignity a multivocal concept. And by that he means that when we say the word dignity, we kind of invoke several traditions all at once. People are not specific about what they mean. They just mean a sort of cluster of things. I think that's a nice way of saying something similar. I'm certainly not on the side of the people who are saying dignity is a useless concept. It seems to me to have immense power, but it's certainly tricky to figure out. So what I want to do one of the things I want this book that I'm working on, Lives of Dignity, to do, one of the things that I want to do in this talk is to propose another way of categorizing different traditions of dignity, not by assigning them to a philosophical tradition per se, or to a country, although I'll try and note as we go where they have been particularly discussed, but just trying to note where dignity lies or resides in different places. So I'm going to play a 40-second video. Don't worry if the sound doesn't come through. So I want to talk then about, I had a few more in the video than I'm going to talk about today, but I want to talk about this idea of where does dignity sit? And I think there's four big places that people talk about across these different traditions. One is inside a person, in a sort of ethereal spark of personhood. One is outside the person in their standing in society, their merit or their status or their capabilities. One is in their physical body, and one is beyond them in their relationships or the community that they're part of, or in something else beyond the individual person. So let's start with inside you, sort of inside your heart. One academic at the University of Notre Dame who I love collaborating with on this work is a guy called Paul Perrin. And I really like his definition. This is the closest to my definition. A lot of what I'm trying to do is observe all this variation, but at some point you've got to pin yourself a little bit to a definition, even if as tentatively as possible. So when I do so, this is the one that just sits best with me. So Paul and his colleagues say, human dignity is the inherent value that every individual possesses equally by virtue of being a human being, independent of one's abilities, characteristics, or actions. Respect for human dignity is acknowledgement of that inherent value by individuals, institutions, and society. So this tradition is the one that often gets called Kantian dignity, although there's lots of detailed debate that we won't go into in here about exactly how much Kant meant that. He himself was using it in a more ragged and uneven way than it's traditionally been treated. And it says two things. It says everybody has dignity no matter who they are or how they have acted. And because they have dignity, they must be respected. They must be treated in a certain way. So we've got this inalienable dignity, no matter who you are, no matter what you've done. And because of that, there's this basic level of respect. We might show more respect to people who've done amazing things. We'll come on to that in a moment. But it says everybody has it. And it focuses mainly on humans, but I guess you could draw your circle however you like, but everybody has it. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this seems to be roughly what they're getting at. When that first line, that introductory line of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being drafted, there became really hot debate with all these representatives from different parts of the world about what they meant by dignity. And eventually, they just sliced off the second half of the sentence where they were going to explain what they meant by dignity. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was chairing it, just said, enough, we're just going to say human dignity and we can all get on board with that ambiguity. But it seems to be that this sort of stuff about rights This sort of stuff is what people are talking about when they talk about the underpinning of human rights. It's also very often described as the Western idea of dignity. And there's certainly the case that you can trace this idea of dignity, a heritage of this idea of dignity, through a number of Enlightenment scholars, a number of Renaissance scholars. There's a philosopher in America called Remy Deebs who wrote Dignity: A History. He does a wonderful job of doing that. But actually, when you move into this more qualitative work, you see this idea popping up a lot. A lot of people say, you've got to treat people right. A lot of people say, you've got to show respect to people no matter who they are. That's a very common thing all over the world. And so it's by no means only there, even if it's not a bad shorthand to talk about it as the Western idea of dignity. The second one that is really common in many Western countries, but really common in a lot of places, is the idea of dignity being on the outside of people. So this is a sort of summary quote from the second Voices of the Poor report, which must be 20-something years old now, but it's still a really cool resource. So they were summarizing what a lot of people had said about dignity in their work, and they said self-respect and dignity, as described by poor people, means being able to live without being a burden to others, living without extending one's hand, living without being subservient to anybody, and being able to bury dead family members decently. And so that is not the same as everybody has dignity no matter what. That's more like you've got dignity if you meet some criteria. And this idea of dignity is, again, one a lot of people subscribe to. People say you only have dignity if you carry yourself in a certain way, or that person who's in that terrible situation still carries themselves with dignity. They're sort of implying that, well, if they didn't carry themselves that way, they would be without dignity. This is an idea of status and merit. I really like the word. There's one scholar called Robert Fuller who talks about this as rankism, the idea of that everybody's on a rank and below certain level, you're without dignity. That can easily be applied to all sorts of hierarchical ways of sorting society, whether that's social class, and there's been lots of work about how the idea of dignity, when it's discussed in the 19th century in Europe, means aristocrats is a dignity of a certain rank, and then as we became more universalist and more egalitarian in the 20th century, or as political society did, we just sort of added a load of people into that aristocratic class. We didn't really change what we meant, we just upgraded everybody to that class. It's also, though, so there's lots about European aristocrats in here, but it's also kind of the idea that Martha Nussbaum is talking about when she starts saying dignity is about what capabilities you have. It's also the idea that some of the refugees interviewed in Syrian refugees interviewed in Lebanon by Kerry Holloway and the Overseas Development Institute, in the Philippines, as part of that same project, IDPs in Mindanao in the Philippines, when they talk about self-reliance, this Voices of the Poor idea, they're all talking about this idea that you only sometimes have dignity. And both of these coexist really easily. Even I, for all that I study this all day and I try and talk about it with such care and precision, even so, I constantly kind of mean both of these. And when other people are saying, oh yeah, well, we should give people dignity through this aid project, I sort of know what they mean. It doesn't feel quite right. I don't like it, but it's a direction that I'm tempted to go down as well. The third idea is that dignity lives not in the personhood, not in something, it lives in something physical. So this is a quote from Frantz Fanon from Black Skin, White Masks. I took myself far off from my own presence, far indeed, and made myself an object. What else could it be for me but an amputation, an excision, a hemorrhage that spattered my whole body with black blood? For Fanon, and for a tradition of writers on Black liberation in both Africa and America and Europe, building on ideas by W.E. Du Bois, and this idea of like the main threat to our dignity is physical, is the assaults that we face, and therefore dignity must implicitly lie there, is really important. And yet it's also one that's been picked up by movements for feminist liberation, the discussion of bodily autonomy, and really constantly asserting that it is in our physicality that dignity lies, in the ways our bodies are treated. And so I said earlier that medicine has often been very universalist in the way it's talked about dignity. But when you compare the work on dignity by medical people working on end-of-life care and intensive care versus the work on dignity by medical people working on maternal health, you see in the maternal health scholars a lot more focus on the body. And then I want to talk just finally about a fourth one. The idea that there's something going on beyond the individual. And there's a lot of different versions of this. The most common that gets talked about is Ubuntu. Ubuntu is often asserted as this idea that dignity really lives in the relationships between people. It's not that Marina has dignity or that I have dignity, but the dignity lives somewhere in between us. That is also often characterized as a uniquely South African or Southern African approach to dignity. There has not been as much social science work with ordinary South Africans about what they think of the idea of Ubuntu as I would love to see. But certainly that is an important idea to a lot of people. It has a sort of popular currency. And yet there's a number of very prolific philosophers writing on the idea of Ubuntu. Thaddeus Metz really argues strongly that this is what Ubuntu is. It's this unique Southern African idea of that dignity lives in the relationships. I'm simplifying here, but somebody who's debated a lot with him is Motsamai Molefe, and he has tended to say, yes, we have Ubuntu, but we also have this concept of Umuntu, which, as I understand it, and this is right at the edges of anything I'm qualified to comment on, or perhaps beyond, is much more about individual personhood. Is much more like our first idea. And so the South African idea of dignity is not neat. And actually, lots of writing on South Africa by Southern Africans. So if you look at Bessie Head's writing, for instance, there's one critic takes a look at Bessie Head's writing and sees in it a lot of work on the idea that people achieve dignity through fulfilling certain capabilities and graduating into full adulthood, full humanity. So there's this sort of complicated, messy idea. There's something about relationships, but people are not simple about the way they talk about it. For others, there's this idea of dignity living not in the individuals, but in the community. Again, there's probably a kind of a bit of both going on. People who are very communal still care somehow about individuals, but ideas of the dignity lives in the group. That is the repository of it. And then there's whole extensions beyond this, huge amounts of work going on about which I confess I have less, perhaps I ought to have more to say on it, but the idea that, well, yes, humans might have dignity, but there's also all these other beings that have dignity, maybe animals or angels or genies or all these different things. Maybe you look at ideas of animism and ways in which different environmental features might have dignity. Robert McFarlane has just published this book called Is a River Alive? About all the political work that is going on to assign rights to forests or rivers, and so there's a whole range of variety of things going on about dignity being beyond you. The way to tear ourselves out of this is not to try and decide. I think one helpful thing we can do is reflect on where we feel individually a state of peace. Donna Hicks talks about the idea of dignity as being this state of peacefulness. And so for each individual, maybe they feel one or several of these, maybe they feel particularly at peace when they're on their own, feeling secure in themselves. Maybe they feel particularly at peace or particularly satisfied when they are reflecting on their achievements and their material goods and the house they've finally been able to buy or something like that. Maybe we feel as individuals particularly at peace when we are moving our body, when we've just exercised, when we're in the water or something like that. Maybe we feel particularly at peace when we're embraced and with a community. And probably for all of us, we feel a couple of those or feel warm about a few of those. But I think that's about as far as we can go. And certainly as I'm working on this book, I'm going to try and keep moving back and forth between I feel perhaps most sympathetic personally, individually, to that first definition. But lots of people feel strongly about this, and almost nobody feels singly about any one of these. A few years ago, we convened a group of scholars to talk about the idea of dignity and where the research ought to go. And we came up with these 5 questions that we think ought to guide the research agenda. I've been talking today a lot about the first one. It may be perhaps in questions that we want to talk about any of the others of these. There's lots of interesting work to be done across this whole research agenda. But for now, I would love to hear what people think. This is something you can hear that I'm still working out for myself. Hopefully gonna write it all up. So really looking forward to your questions and reflections, and thank you so much.
No, it's working. Yes, I think it is. Wonderful. Thanks so much, Tom. Very well timed. And yeah, really interesting to hear of those sort of the grappling with the complexity of it. I often think that when there is such complexity in a concept, it's we're onto something, right? So maybe just to kind of kick us off. I know there's one comment in the chat which I'll come to, so others online, please do put your questions in the chat and we can come to them. But as you were talking, I was thinking a little bit about this idea of the sort of the first view of dignity and the more kind of individual, perhaps Western, although not only, and the idea of the more relational. And that's something that in the work we do here, particularly around trying to understand community-led development or participatory processes of development, we talk often of agency, right? And we think about that both in terms of the critical consciousness and self-efficacy ideas of agency, but then also collective agency and ability to take sort of collective action. And a bit like you said, it's not either or, right? It's probably both and. But it does raise quite big questions about that second point of measurement and how, if you are using this as a concept to understand what development can achieve, how do you deal with that? And I know that you've done a lot of work on thinking about how to measure dignity. So maybe you could reflect on how those two particular views how they then influence what your evaluation or measurement agenda becomes.
Yeah. When we're looking at what practically should we do about all of this, I started with this broken promise in development, and by that we don't mean that we ought to be using the right words per se. We mean that services are delivered or absent in ways that are harmful to people, that people go hungry or go without medical care or are harmed by medical care. Therefore, a lot of this should focus on practicalities. When we're debating practicalities, a frequent conversation partner about the practicalities of this are the people at the agency fund. And obviously for them, their big concept, the big thing they like to talk about is agency. And for me, it's dignity. And yet when we're making recommendations, we often find ourselves making quite similar recommendations. I think both these ideas often are guiding us towards parallel ideas about what you can do in the world, because there's only a certain number of recommendations you can make that organizations are capable of digesting. At some point, you end up recommending training or adjustments to performance or messaging by management, or there's only a certain number of ways of moving a bureaucracy. Obviously, one of the great ways of moving a bureaucracy is measurement, is getting to pay attention to different metrics. I think there are two big approaches that have been taken in attempting to construct measures of dignity, and both of them have a big flaw. The first attempt to do this is what I would roughly associate with medical work on dignity. I said earlier, people working on medicine have tended to fix to a particular definition of dignity. Different scholars have had their different ones. Often it's been based on some very thoughtful theoretical work, some good grounded theory stuff, but then they have picked it and fixed it and said, this is our definition of dignity. And when you look at the measurement options that they offer, the surveys that they offer, they tend to be these things that they are asked of the patient, but they could almost be filled out by an observer. They're kind of objective things. They're behaviors. Did the doctor do this? Yes or no? That gives you something quite practical that you can rely on, and there's not so much like uncertainty about did it happen or not, but it has no room for anybody else's definition of dignity. It takes, this is our definition of dignity, was it fulfilled or not? Were people treated with respect in the way we would define it or not? And then the other big tradition of measurement, sorry, I'm going on a bit about this, but the other big tradition of measurement is this one about subjective dignity. And that's the one I've tended to be keener to do because I work across different countries and different definitions. And so I want to ask questions that are along the lines of, were you treated in the way you feel you ought to be treated? And that allows lots of room for people to bring their own definitions of how they ought to be treated and what respect and dignity means to them. The big flaw with that one is what gets called in the literature adaptive preferences or the expectations problem, that what you might end up doing is getting the most, paying the most attention, making programmatic decisions based on these outraged people who felt they were treated very disrespectfully, but that's because life has taught them to have very high expectations of how they ought to be treated. And so you might end up moving all your program and resources to try and mollify the wealthiest people in your program, while you might well get responses from people who have very great needs who say, well, were you treated as you expect to be treated? And they shrug their shoulders and say, yeah, it was no worse than normal. I'm usually badly treated, and this was, yeah, it was fine. And that would mean that you'll end up focusing, you're not using a sort of poverty focus, you're moving your attention away from the people who perhaps need the most help. So you should never, although I like these subjective measures, you should never just look at that. You should always be looking at the subjective measure plus some way of breaking it down, some way of zooming in on the experiences of people or subgroups that you're most interested in. Even that's not a full resolution of that problem, but I think those are the two big ways that people have approached it.
Thanks. And yeah, said with the skill of somebody who understands methodologies. So are there any thoughts in the room? Because we've got a couple of questions online, but yeah, maybe I'll go to you, Stephen, and then so why don't we take the two in the room, and then those of you online, I've seen your questions. We'll come to them in a minute. Stephen.
Thanks, Tom. Really interesting, great presentation. A lot of my work here at the Institute of Development Studies is around disability and disability inclusion. And of course, the Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities, inherent dignity is right up there in the general principle. So it's really interesting to kind of hear that reflected again in the broader human rights side of things. But I thought as you were running through the different options, as it were, or the different models for dignity, while some of them fitted quite nicely into disability rights and what that movement is trying to achieve, some of it I actually found quite problematic. So the rankism, for example, and that idea of kind of burden and whether people are viewed as a burden, and perhaps that will influence whether or not they're deserving of dignity. I could feel the hackles rising slightly because I actually think it's quite problematic. So I was wondering whether, you know, in your initial reading so far and where you've got to with your thoughts for the book, have you come across disability? Because of course disability is part of the human experience. It's found, you know, across cultures, across countries. And so for me, it might be my, you know, bias in terms of my own research interests, but I can see disability having a major part of the dignity story. Thank you.
So I was thinking about this very interesting tension that can be between dignity and hierarchy, no? In the sense that different ranks of people will expect different ways of dignity, but at the same time, like a universal dignity can be very disruptive to those kinds of ranks, no? Like think about vaccination campaigns, no? Everyone has to go there, and maybe you will have the pushiest man having to stand in the sun in a queue, no? So yeah, I found that interesting. And I also found it interesting what you said about disabilities, no? Like at the same time, to an extent, you need to have like certain kinds of, it's not about privilege, no? It's like distinguishing dignity from notions of dignity that are privileged, and also maybe making space for special needs, no? Like older people, don't make them make a queue. Yeah.
I think the conventional way in which we conceptualize a dignity interaction is between an individual citizen and a institution, a patient seeks care from a hospital, and we tend to look at that one at a time, one patient on one day in one appointment. That is a helpful simplification often. It allows you to pay attention really in depth to that interaction. And did somebody come away from that feeling they've been treated in the right way? But then it becomes a less useful guide for what economists like to call general equilibrium, for a broader society, for resolving all these tensions. It's quite helpful for like one person in front of you, but if you've got a whole ward of patients and you're trying to figure out, well, who should be treated first, that's dignity is a harder guide. One way that this often plays out in the development world is in debates between respectful, participatory, grounded work and efficient, fast work reaching the maximum number of people. And you can simplify this down to, people are hungry, we've got a truck of food, we can get to 3 villages if each time we have a really thoughtful ceremony of handing it over, or we can get to 5 villages if we just throw it out the back of the truck. That, I don't know if I accept that binary, but it is the one I often get when I'm talking to charity leaders. The first thing we can say to that is, at least let's adopt the practice of using these measurement tools for all their failings. And then we can have a debate about trade-offs, having at least checked both sides of the equation. Because right now we only really collect data about the efficiency side of it, and we don't really know much about people's experience, or at least researchers, places like IDS know a lot about that, but the average charity leader looking at his monitoring and evaluation system doesn't necessarily know much about people's experience of dignity. So we can at least check both sides of it and see how are we disrupting those hierarchies, how are we handling that trade-off, if indeed it is a trade-off. There's also a good amount of evidence that when people have experiences that are respectful of their dignity, they're more, they're happier, and there's all these other benefits that we might care about. So difficult to apply dignity simply to wider group or societal equilibria, I think. The point about disability is, I think, a really important one. There is, well, first of all, I would benefit from spending more time with that literature and people who've been working on that. There is, when we talk about a dignity of capabilities, that is indeed the whole idea of work on capabilities has been plagued by really dumb comments about disability, and implications of that thinking that don't really take account of people who have whose capabilities may be limited by some external thing, but who nonetheless clearly ought to have dignity. And therefore, the most, I think, comfortable idea for disability justice advocates is the first idea of dignity, the insistence that everyone has dignity no matter what. Looking then, but we can also look at this third idea of dignity, this dignity of the body, which clearly ideas of bodily autonomy are enormously important to disability activism. But at the same time, identifying a damage to body as a damage to their dignity doesn't feel quite right either. Or at least it doesn't to me, because I'm so sympathetic to that first idea of dignity, that they have dignity no matter what. Picking your way through this is really hard, and I think we kind of mean several of these all at once. There is so much work on this that I know I would benefit from spending more time on.
Great, thanks. Thanks for that, Tom. So I'm going to share 3 questions from the online chat, if that's okay. So the first one from Irene Kut. Apologies, Irene. I still can't say your name properly. She says, thank you. Many echoes with the theme that she's working on, which is hope. And so, which is a similarly essential enigma thing. So it sort of inevitably exists. So the question she asks is, what value is there in measuring dignity? Who benefits and how from the measurement, given it is something that inevitably exists? There's a question here from Taufike Jorda, and who asks, what is the difference between dignity and respect? Or are they the same? I think you touched on that, but maybe you could elaborate. And then from John Kunrod, who has actually he has a double question. The first is that he'd like to hear what you think of Tim Shriver's Dignity Index. And his question is, he says, we're living through a period of rising fascism, which completely rejects the notion of human dignity. What does this research teach us about what we might do about this? So some meeting ones there for you.
I'm really attracted to the idea of studying the concept of hope. That sounds like such a fascinating way to look at it. As I was walking through IDS today, I was thinking about how much I like the architecture here, because it seems to be this attempt by a bunch of sort of British institutional people to look forward to the future in the way it's designed. That doesn't feel very present in the way we build buildings anymore. Why measure? I think I'm most tempted to give a pragmatic answer, an answer about social change more than one about scholarship. About scholarship, I mean, I'm not really any one academic tradition. I've got weird academic background, but I work with a lot of economists, and I like quantitative approaches, and to some extent, the idea of why measure is, well, of course you'd want to measure. More useful than that, I think, is that quantitative measures are one of the things that institutions know how to react to. And so if we're talking about development, not just as a field of study, but as a set of charities and government agencies attempting to do things in the world, and if we're talking about the negative effects of the disrespectful way in which they currently do that, then measurement of that, even with, I think, very imperfect measures, is one of the ways you can get people to pay attention to that, to track and notice and think every in all their quarterly KPI meetings or whatever it is, however it is they organize themselves, that how are we doing on dignity? Oh, still really badly. That's a bit embarrassing. Maybe we should try and do something about that. The ideas of dignity and respect are really tightly intertwined in the way I talk about them. I tend to say that dignity is the thing people have no matter who they are or what they've done, and therefore the consequence of that is that others around them have this duty of respect towards bearers of dignity. That, as I've said, is very close to this sort of Kantian Western-ish, inside the person idea of dignity. You will often find literature, particularly when looking at maternal care, that talks about respectful maternal care and doesn't have a whole lot to say about dignity, and yet feels like exactly the same thing as what I'm talking about, which is how can a service provider or a doctor or medical institution act in a way where people come away feeling treated as they would hope to be treated. Finally, I really like the Dignity Index work that Tim Shriver and a number of other colleagues have recently published. This is a different measurement attempt. So a lot of what I was talking about with measurement was, how do we measure the concept of people's experience of a service interaction? There's lots of other things you might want to measure. And one of those is, the one that they try to measure is, are other people embracing an ethic of dignity or not? And I mentioned Mansour Lalji's work earlier. He tries to measure, do people embrace an ethic of dignity through his respect for persons measure, and he takes the approach of a social psychologist. It's this really well thought out 26 or so survey item questionnaire. The Dignity Index tries to do this in the manner of people trying to achieve political change. And so the Dignity Index looks at, when you observe the speech of a politician or any public leader, do they embrace an ethic of respecting people, or do they embrace an ethic of contempt for people who are outside their group? Are they universalist, or are they only there for the people that they serve? Do they threaten violence or disrespect against people? It's a really lovely, well-communicated project. The whole website's got these tools, these nice talking points. I think it's a really beautiful marriage of activist intent and thoughtful drawing on scholarship. That is one of a bunch of efforts, particularly in the United States, for in recent years, for obvious reasons, that have tried to use human dignity either as a way to get out of or around the partisan divide, or as a way to respond to the contempt of the right in that partisan divide. I think the Harvard sociologist Michelle Lamont has written really well in her most recent book, The Meaning of Recognition, about the ways in which the idea of dignity might be a resolution to people proffering contempt in their politics. Feels like we're not winning, so hopefully some new ideas, including maybe dignity, will be worth a try. One thing I will note is that all the way through this, Paul Perrin has this really nice idea of benevolent and malevolent dignity. Or malevolent and benevolent disrespect for dignity, rather. And most of what I've talked about here is benevolent disrespect. People who are fundamentally quite well-intentioned, but the way the bureaucracies are set up ends up messing people around. And people end up leaving the interaction, feeling deeply disappointed. And if you could only tell, or if you could only change the incentives for the people who set up those bureaucracies, they would correct that. Clearly, there's a whole other stream of work that needs to be done on malevolent disrespect, about the ways in which people deliberately disrespect the dignity of others through violence, through violent political rhetoric, through the violence of armies or of individuals. I have spent less time on that, again, for this pragmatic reason, that there's no partner you can work with to, I mean, they mean to do that. I mean, one of the great sources of disrespect that I end up experiencing in my life is with visa authorities. I mostly think, well, the systems are deliberately set up to achieve those disrespectful results. So telling them they're being disrespectful would please them more than it would surprise them and prompt them to change things. Perhaps that's a fairly pessimistic view. Maybe there are partners out there who are just waiting to be told, "Oh, you're being disrespectful," and they'll suddenly realize. But I have tended to focus much more on this benevolent disrespect.
And Irene says in the chat that malevolent versus benevolent dignity echoes honest versus false hope. So that might be something you would want to look into. She also responding to your response to her question about why measure. And I was thinking something similar as I was hearing you speak. That actually there's a lot of data that actually becomes the object of harmful non-reaction by senior leadership, as Elena puts it. So, yeah. So having more numbers and having more data, I don't believe necessarily translates into action. But maybe adding to that, because I had a sneak preview of the introduction, or at least the draft introduction of the book, and there's a piece in there which Tom didn't talk about, where he lays out what he calls 3 pathways to respecting dignity, and you talk about recognition, moving to agency, moving to equality. I'm very biased by anything that's called a pathway. Seems like something interesting, but also it kind of opens up for me the question of how and why, which, as you would know also from the other work we're doing, that from a kind of evaluation perspective, I think those are the questions that might be more fruitful or interesting. So I wondered if you wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about those 3 pathways, but noticing there are a couple of other questions in the chat as well, but maybe you could speak to that.
Start with the pathways then. I don't consider these pathways a core part of the definition of dignity. the people are treated in a way that respects their dignity once they say that they've been treated in a way that respects their dignity. There's no like surefire thing, and because people have such varied definitions of how they want to be treated, we just have to keep checking. But obviously, if you're going to start thinking about, are there things we could do better? Are there practices by development actors or indeed by researchers who have their own bureaucracies that need to make sure they're being respectful? Are there practices we should praise, practices we should try to phase out? Obviously, we want to think about, are there consistent ways in which people want to be respected? And three ideas that seem to keep coming up across traditions, and as we've started to test them in more empirical work, seem to keep coming up in qualitative research, seem to elicit responses in experimental research, are these ideas of these three pathways to respecting dignity. So one is recognition. People seem to want to feel seen and to see themselves represented in an institution they're interacting with. One is agency. People want choices and a meaningful chance to consent. And the third is equality. People want to, even where power differentials persist, as very often they do in development, people nonetheless want to be treated as a fundamental equal, and they want to know that they're being treated equal with those around them. And these three ideas, again, striking less of a scholarship note and more of a pragmatic note, they seem to just be helpful in generating ideas. They seem to be helpful in workshops, in getting people who are running charity programs or who are philanthropic foundations thinking about which programs they want to reward and support. They seem to be helpful in getting people to generate ideas. It's quite quick to be able to say, well, what would help you feel seen in an interaction? Well, I'd like to be addressed by name. Is that everything? No, being addressed by name probably doesn't make that much difference if that's all it is. So I want it to be tailored to me in some way, and I want to know that they've put the effort into tailoring it to me, and so on and so on. Those three ideas, I think, help make it a bit more concrete for people who are trying to figure it out. Obviously, whatever ideas they generate from that need to be checked against people's definition, the specific people they're trying to serve and their definition of dignity, and eventually those people's sense of, well, once we made those changes, were you treated in the way you would expect to be treated?
Yeah, I mean, I like that. I think for me, it still hits up a bit up against what I said initially, which is a lot of the work we do is looking at sort of collective processes of change. So I think for me, I still struggle a bit with you have to actually speak to every individual, right? When, if you're trying to open up sort of pathways to shift dynamics and systems, then is that the right unit of analysis always? So sort of open question. But there's a couple of other comments in the chat, which we're circling around this question, I think, a bit of is measurement helpful, right? And so one question essentially is inviting you to share any examples you have where actually measurement has helped to prevent violation of people's dignity. So maybe you could have examples actually where you could give us a bit more hope that measurement might lead to some behavior change. And then another question, which sort of goes a bit back to the conversation we were having earlier about given that the whole development sector is moving towards more cost effectiveness. I think you mentioned it before. What does that mean for talking about dignity in this moment?
We'll start with this question of cost effectiveness. It is very possible, and I do make arguments that dignity will also be cost effective, or dignity will also be impactful. People place strong valuations on being treated in a way that respects their dignity. When people have interactions that respect their dignity, they seem to come away from that. We see these individual benefits to them. People happier, have higher self-efficacy. We see these, what we might call programmatic benefits. People are more willing to recommend a program, more willing to return to it and complete a number of sessions. These things that, if you're leading a charity program or a government service, you probably want to see, and hopefully this program is good for them, and that is helpful. And we seem to see, although these things are tricky to pin down, these wider societal benefits. People seem to be more cooperative with one another, more altruistic. So there are good reasons to think that dignity is impactful in itself. If we're going to increasingly focus on cost effectiveness, as we must, there's less money, decisions must be made. Decisions always had to be made, and money should always be spent well, of course. It's better to spend money on things that are working than things that are not. But if we're going to do that, then what we think of as working must be thoughtfully constructed. And if it's just dailies or just income, then we haven't got it right. So that, of course, is easy to say and much harder to do, but I would argue just for making sure that dignity is in the group of things that we are monitoring as we're judging between programs. When these brutal decisions are being made, hopefully by empathetic leaders who are struggling with their limitations and trying to do their best. Obviously, that was not the way it was done in the United States. And there was no intent to do it well by most of the people who were making decisions. The examples of measurement leading to good practice. I think that I earlier mentioned the work of Paul Perrin. He is a professor of practice now at the University of Notre Dame, but before that he ran the monitoring and evaluation function at Catholic Relief Services. Catholic Relief Services has always had a philosophy derived from Catholic social teaching that has placed this great emphasis on dignity. But they have also grown gigantically over the decades, and they are beset by all of the classic challenges of INGOs, of like funding silos and project timelines and the bureaucracy of trying to stand up a program for a few years and failures to align that work with the preferences of the people who these are serving, and all of these things, just because they're so big. And for them, their work over the last few years on reviving the idea of dignity within the organization has been, I think, personally important and satisfying to many of the people involved in that, and I think they're proud that they're doing it. But I think it started to bite for them when they started developing and deploying measures of dignity in their programs, because the people who were so many layers divorced from the actual implementation of the program suddenly had this very clear signal of, we are not upholding the values that we set out to. And it was something, it was painful for them to see. This is a classic case of benevolent disrespect, where like they really wanted to do it right. And so from those examples and from those programs, there have been changes to re-emphasize dignity, try and express values. A lot of that has been disrupted hugely this year. I think it was really starting to come in last year, and we're not quite sure. CRS was the largest recipient for years, and the largest non-profit recipient for years and years of US aid funds. So they are experiencing huge disruption right now. I know one hope of some of the people I have worked with at Catholic Relief Services is that they that in hard times there may be a recommitment to values that they have always held, but it is hard to keep following that through to programs that are suddenly not existent anymore.
But what I find really interesting about that example is, if we're thinking about what are the conditions under which adding a measurement element in might stimulate action, and it sounds that it's values alignment to begin with, but also that they did the internal work.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're reflecting on what it means internally to uphold the value of dignity or to respect, then maybe you're more likely to use some sort of hard numbers that help you to see what it means out there in the world. So that's quite interesting, I think, to think about it in those terms. I think we've got another question in the room.
Please.
Hello, thank you so much for that talk. My name is Ria. I am a master's student here. My master's thesis is about relationship building. And so this was very, very helpful. And where I come from back in India, there's a lot of talk now about dignity in the workplace, which is similar to the example we were just giving. And I'm just wondering if there are organizations that are maybe smaller than perhaps the Catholic Relief Services who have implemented measures of dignity, done this like internal work to create just better workplaces.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, the work on relationships and relational institutions is, I think, very closely parallel to these ideas of dignity, and lots of the work that's going on that I think is really exciting, and I'm hopeful that that does offer some ways in which institutions might do better at respecting dignity. The sector, if we can call it that, of employment and work feels like one of those that has in its advocates and its people who are thinking about it, people do keep returning to dignity more than many other sectors. I would say medicine is perhaps one of the development sectors that has talked most about dignity, but I would say employment is perhaps the second on that. And if you look at the most important philanthropic funder and therefore determiner of a lot of the rhetoric around this in the in the employment sector of development is MasterCard Foundation, and for them, dignity is something they feel very strongly about. One of the first things I wanted to do with this work quite a few years ago now was check that it wasn't impossible. Check that I wasn't just setting a standard that nobody could meet, that it was possible to build programs that respect dignity. And for that work, we adopted just a case study approach. This was not about going in and surveying 1,000 firms and seeing which ones came out top. But it was just about trying to find those bright lights, people whose organizations had really wrestled with that, both in their internal culture of employment and in their external culture of how they were treating the people they serve. And I was both moved and relieved to find that there were places that I really respected, not because they were perfect, but because they were wrestling with this every day. It was right at the heart of their culture and how they define themselves. And so within the charity world, I think places like Partners in Health, places like Gunj in India, gigantic, not a small organization, which you asked for, places like ATD Fourth World, which Kiti Rowland has recently written very thoughtfully about their practices, have really done remarkable job to think about dignity, both as an internal culture and as something that they transmit into their programming. I think that in terms of rethinking employment and the world of work, I really respect both the scholarship and activism of WIEGO, WIEGO, women in informal economy. Forgive me, I can't remember what it. They study gendered experiences of informal economies, and I think they do fantastic work. And we have also at IDinsight recently been studying the experiences of gig workers working for digital platforms. An area where many people, including myself, when I first started thinking about this, are very quick to say this is a very disrespectful form of work. The responses we get from those drivers and riders and delivery people is that they, and I'm also drawing here not just on our research, but also on the research of Julie Zollman in Nairobi, is that they find a lot of respect and affirmation of their dignity in these roles. And they talk very clearly about, well, what the other things that they might be doing, and indeed the brutality that they might be experiencing in some of those other roles. Is that enough? Clearly, dignity is not everything. Well, first of all, maybe that some affirmation of dignity is not enough, and maybe those roles should do more to affirm their dignity. But maybe also you can say, yeah, it's great that by starting driving for Uber, you felt an affirmation of your dignity. And also we can say that this is still socioeconomically unjust, and people should be, and the company and the wider society that produces that have a great duty to provide a better situation. I think it's important. Of course, I focus on dignity, and that leads me to keep saying, well, what we need to do is focus more on dignity, and it is certainly not everything. Clearly, a world in which everybody felt respected, but nobody lived very long or was able to live very pleasant lives would not be what we desire. There are a bunch of other things we need to care about in development. I focus on dignity because it feels like one we're missing, rather than because I think it's the whole answer.
You touched there. There's just a couple more questions in the chat, and I think then we can wrap up. But you started, I think, to touch a bit on what Mariko Ikawa asks, which is dignity something that we can support people to develop for themselves? So is it like self-confidence? So, because you have talked a lot about the service delivery, right, and the respect that's offered to people. So this connects a bit to what was sort of coming up in my mind around agency or critical consciousness building, like the extent to which if dignity is something that is within us and is in the body, then is that something that can be activated from within as well? So that's one question. And then maybe the final one, you touched upon it a little bit, I think, with MasterCard Foundation, but it's what has been your experience from philanthropists when you talk about dignity and the work that they fund? So people funding, is that a different experience? Right. So yeah, a few minutes to answer those.
Yeah. On this first question about whether we can do more to help people feel their dignity, of course, as I said, I feel closest to that first definition of they have dignity already. But maybe there's something we can do to raise their expectations so they don't so that we don't fall into that expectations trap in the subjective measures. Maybe there's something we can do to help them put that at the forefront or care about it. I would tend to think of those things as closer to critical consciousness raising. And so I'm more inclined to say it's already there. It would be good for the world if more people talked about it and noticed it. It would be especially good for the world if more people who hold power and are making decisions were more deferential to people's dignity. But it's perhaps more morally important to ensure that and perhaps it's a path to getting those in power to care about it that ordinary people are caring about this. There are also many ways in which we one-on-one fail to respect the dignity of each other, and we may hope that by bringing this to the forefront that we reduce some of that interpersonal disrespect. So I think always very careful in the way I talk about it to not talk about how can we give people dignity, but there must be loads of stuff we can be doing in our actions in the world around the dignity concept, or inspired by or in alignment with the dignity concept. One of those, I talked about people with power. Clearly, philanthropic foundations are central to driving, at the very least, innovation in international development, or newer or on the edge approaches. And increasingly, as governments seem to give up on their duty to do this work, or as rich countries seem to default on their obligations to do so, they become also funders of the bulk of the mainstream work. There has been, I think, quite a lot of positive response when I've been working with philanthropic foundations on this. So we worked with a number recently with the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, with the Wellcome Trust, with GiveWell, and they've all seemed quite, they've valued this idea of dignity. One particular case study that perhaps is worth mentioning is the organization The Life You Can Save. Not a classical foundation, and they do not have some endowment that they distribute, but rather people give them money, they decide which charities to pass it on to, and they do a lot of research and a lot of thinking about which charities they respect the most and so on. They have always, when you applied to become a charity that would receive funds from them, you had to demonstrate how many people you were reaching, and that you were doing it very cost effectively, and you're doing it in a way where you would keep on learning about your approach. About a year ago, any new charity who wanted to become recommended by The Life You Can Save also had to start justifying the ways in which they would respect the dignity of the people they're serving. And that's now, this year, being extended, as I understand it, to all of the existing charities that they've long recommended they will also have to account for that. Charities will not necessarily in the first round be kicked off the group just for not quite knowing how to answer that question on a form, but they'll have to justify it, and then they'll be given some resources and advice about the types of practices that the organizations that are doing well on affirming dignity seem to embody, and whether there are things they could introduce to that.
It's wonderful that you can bring so many concrete examples. Your sort of wealth of understanding, both of the conceptual and sort of theoretical side of this, but also what's going on in the practice, I think is really wonderful. So thank you for all of that. So I think we can probably start wrapping up. And I guess just something that, Tom, we should probably talk about more, maybe not now, but as we continue the conversation with our partners in the Full Spectrum Coalition, so that's Tostan, One Village Partners, and Legado, and as we're working with them to think about this evaluation and learning agenda, I wonder how we bring together some of the thinking that we've done around understanding participatory processes, building collective action, etc., critical consciousness, and your work on dignity. And I wonder how conceptually we bring those things together in that work. So I'm sure we'll keep talking about that. So just to say a huge thank you to Tom for sharing his wisdom with us. To everybody who's still online, thank you so much for joining and for all your great questions. I hope we did manage to get to all of them. Thank you to those in the room who have taken a bit of time out of the beautiful sunny weather outside to be with us. And yeah, we look forward to seeing the book when it's done, and maybe having you come back and doing another seminar, which is now on the book itself.
I love that.
So, thanks very
Might
much.
take a while. Thank you, folks.